So you no doubt know or have seen the Kraut meme that Leave.EU put out and very quickly disowned it. Why? Well, we're going to go through that exact thing today. The Independent, Sean O'Grady, put out an amazing article on just this. So it's no wonder Brexiteers tried to disown the Merkel Kraut meme. It revealed their twisted worldview for all to see. We didn't win two world wars to be pushed around by a kraut, read the witty Leave.EU meme. No wit at all, of course, but you could see what they were trying to do. The same thing they were trying to do in all their memes, which is amateur journalism. Trying to recreate the sort of innovative puns and cheeky defiance that you see on the front page of The Sun. They just ended up being offensive and not really making much of a point. We can only thank Providence that the Leave.EU meme designed workshop didn't seem fit to add a Hitler tash and a Nazi armband to Angela Merkel's features, or to stick her on top of a Panzer, adding some utterly horrific reference to the Holocaust for good measure, because that's what Leave.EU lot are like, boneheads with no experience of war or bloodshed. The Leave.EU propaganda is not even tasteless, tasteless but funny, in a red top sort of way. Nor is it an elegant as the famous scene in the Fawlty Towers episode, The Germans, when Basil, goose-stepping around his restaurant, can't help himself going on about the war to a German family. When the daughter gets up and her father comforts her, the exchange goes like this. Basil, is there something wrong? German guest, will you stop talking about the war? Basil, me, you started it. German guest, we did not. Basil, yes, you did. You invaded Poland. Only if Lee.EU bunch had any of that comedic flair, the ability to mime humour from the heart of an embedded deep in the national psyche. Instead, the funny, clod-hopping fools all just fell back on a now rarely used football fan insult. It is unworthy even of the likes of Trice, of Aaron Banks. Leave.EU, however, said sorry, but it was a revealing moment. The gross, graceless and childish, just like when Nigel Farage and Anne Widdecombe turned their backs on the young musicians at the European Parliament opening ceremony. They ought to have gone for the full moon and got their arses out, just to demonstrate their complete contempt for the new Belgian Empire. They might have stuck their fingers in their ears so that they didn't have to listen to that music, because that Kraut Beethoven composed it. But maybe next time. The British used to be regarded by the Europeans as a practical, clever, polite. Now they look more like the worst sort of spiteful kids a country's repressing into a second childhood, sustained by legends of a golden age that never was. But this is much more about manners than there is a political point. The Kraut isn't pushing us around anywhere, anyway. All she's doing is telling us we cannot have our cake and eat it. You cannot insist on what you want if you own objectives that are incompatible. You must simultaneously you cannot be simultaneously inside and outside a customs union. You cannot both have and not have a border with Ireland. That is not a matter for German obstinance or arrogance, but of British obstinacy and arrogance. It is in reality a simple matter of logic and of the UK's inability to confront it. It is all a piece, this mindset, this vast exaggeration of the UK's importance to the EU and the world. Dominic Cummings, according to briefings, threatens our EU states who favour giving the UK an Article 50 extension in its own parliament as legislated for. And if we did fight two world wars for parliamentary democracy, he says that they will be back at the queue for a second for security assistance, presumably in the event of a Russian invasion or something else. More likely ISIS-inspired terror and far-right extremism. Quite apart from berating the NATO treaty obligations that we share with most of the EU states, it's hardly in the UK's interest to allow Vladimir Putin to exercise undue influence over European affairs or to occupy Estonia and bully Germany. Nor is it refusing to cooperate with the Irish authorities on the resurgence of IRA terrorism. And then, of course, there is the strange obsession with the war. It's nothing new. The British might not know much about the slave trade, or the ancient Romans, or the Napoleonic Wars, but references to Arnhem, the Battle of Britain, El Alamein, Dunkirk, Churchill's finest hour, Hitler, Goebbels only has one war, are universally understood. As late as the 1970s, after we joined the European Economic Community, I was an avid consumer of boys' comics, such as Warlord and Victor. I was enthralled by the stories featuring heroes such as Union Jack Jackson and the Bomber Badrock. The Squareheads or Krauts were invariably cruel or stupid or both, and shouting things like Achtung and Gott im Himmel. When the Royal Marines sank their U-boats, the ever-brilliant episode of Dad's Army is on the BBC iPlayer by popular demand. And then there are all those guys who dress up in the RAF and SS uniforms at reenactment exercises, like they were in an episode of Hello Hello. Then there's Winston Spencer Churchill, whose amazing life and times are the subject of endless films and books, including one by Boris Johnson. Scholars still argue about whether he was or not in favour of bringing Britain in part of the United States of Europe. All references to the Tory rebel MP's Nicholas Soames are prefaced by his statue with the words Churchill's grandson. In her landmark Bruges speech in 1988, Margaret Thatcher reminded her audience that it was from our island fortress that the liberation of Europe itself was mounted, as if they didn't know or had forgotten their own history. And now we have the Surrender Act, with opponents of a no-deal Brexit labelled as collaborators and quislings, when the Prime Minister of Luxembourg empty podiums standing beside was meant to be filled by Johnson himself, and he was sharply reminded that the British had liberated the Grand Duchy in the last war, even though it was the Americans. The basic attitude is that Britain's heroic achievements of 1939 to 45 mean that Europeans owe us a living and that they should do as they're told, because otherwise they'd all be speaking German, apart from the Germans, of course, and the Austrians, who all rather speak good English these days, and Leave.EU, who are fond of the term Kraut. In particular, the further we get away from the last war, the more we seem to want to start another one. This time we'd lose, but there we are. This bellicose, irrational British mentality continues to bewilder all our European allies, and truth be told, most of Britain too. The last Tommies of the Great War have all gone, and the men and women who survived 1939 to 45 are in their 90s now. They are often fetishized along with the rest of our brave armed forces, who are co-opted without consent into the Leave cause. Yet many, precisely because of their wartime experiences, are enthusiastic Europeans and Remainers. It was a generation of European statesmen who had witnessed the degradation that humanity is capable of, who decided that Europe must never have another of its bloody wars. It is from that conviction that the European project springs. It is why Ted Heath and Roy Jenkins, both ex-servicemen, made it their life's work to get Britain into the EU and to keep it there. And that generation has also gone. And all we are left with now are our false memories and our national catchphrase, don't mention the war. And it's true. About yesterday, we had an amazing article. We went through deep yesterday into that, and again, it was really good. And this is once again by posting that meme. It is, completely skewered and shown the Brexiteers what their worldview is. This idea that Europe somehow owes us for the liberation during the Second World War. Europe owes us nothing. And to quote Bonnie Greer on Question Time, Ireland owes us nothing. You know, we are a nation that has fetishized our history, and it has done immense damage to us. And Brexit is just one of those many cuts.